Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Friday, November 6, 2020. The numbers are solidifying, supporting leads in Georgia, Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Nevada for Joe Biden. And it's fairly certain now that he will get the 270 electoral votes needed to push Trump out of office. And we'll get to the presidential race in a bit here. I want to begin today by looking at House Democrats. They held a 3-hour caucus telephone conference call yesterday. And publicly, Nancy Pelosi has announced her priorities for the next session of the House. She wants to take on ethics, lobbying. She wants to undo barriers to voting and reduce the influence of money in politics. These all sound really good. But number one, they're dead on arrival in Mitch McConnell's Senate. And number two, the Democrats, when you talk about reducing the influence of money in politics, just came off the most obscene level of spending in any campaign in my lifetime. They raised over $1 billion for the Senate. I don't know the exact number for the House, but it was hefty. And now the finger-pointing has begun, because that 3-hour call included a lot of angry comments from centrist, corporate, military, and spook-related members of Congress. And the loudest voices came from the most conservative Democrats. Here is Stephanie Murphy. She's co-chair of the Blue Dogs in the House. And she criticized Democrats for insufficiently supporting Israel, for being tagged with the word socialism, for the advocates of Black Lives Matter and criminal justice reform calling for defunding the police. And she was joined by Abigail Spanberger. And she is one of the spooks who got elected to Congress in 2018. And I am forever grateful to the World Socialist website reporter Patrick Martin, who did a great job in 2018 and in 2020, identifying those who were recruited to run as Democrats for the House, who had deep ties to the CIA, other elements of the intelligence community, and the military. And we saw the Democrats unsuccessfully run female fighter pilots in Texas and in Kentucky, and both lost. And so the prescription that the future of the Democratic Party, that winning elections means moving to the right and being more like the Republicans, is just so fundamentally wrong. And this will probably be my final screed about this before I retire. But I've been fighting a losing struggle since the 1990s. This is what caused me to leave the Democratic Party. Because Bill Clinton's Democratic Leadership Council, the Third Way, being tough on crime and pro-death penalty, pro-business, leaving behind the working families, and in particular the working poor in this country. The Democratic Party has been completely transformed. It was once the anti-war party when George W. Bush was the president, but it's become much more hawkish. The comment from Murphy about Israel, showing that many of these conservaDems, as I call them, they want to be like Republicans. Now, I do understand that in the areas where Spanberger and Murphy run for Congress, that they're damn lucky to be able to get elected as Democrats at all. Spanberger took over a district where a Tea Party Republican had previously won a fairly large victory. And she actually won this time by about the same percentage, 1.2%, as she did last time. And so her entitled frame here is that she is personally threatened by the Squad, by Bernie Sanders, by the promoters of a Green New Deal and Medicare for All. And she wants them to sit down and shut up. And here's another quote from Murphy. She said the House leadership team was putting lipstick on a pig by touting the fact that they held the majority in the House and will hold the speakership. This playing footsies with socialism is not going to win over most of America, she said. There's no amount of lipstick that can cover up the fact that these far-left ideas are costing us races. And then there's Jim Clyburn, the Democrat who takes credit for all of the African-American votes that put Joe Biden ahead of Bernie Sanders in the Democratic primary this year. And he's offering similar advice, basically saying, relative to these two runoffs for the Senate in Georgia, those two seats offer us the opportunity to change the dynamics in the Senate, but we're going to have to win those seats to do it. Medicare for all, or defunding police, or socialized medicine, he said, we're not going to win if that's what we stand on. And I think that's ass backwards. Exit polling showed 72% of voters favor transitioning to, and this is the language, a government-run health care plan. I never describe it that way. It's not government-run. Government provides the insurance and takes out the middleman, the profiteers of the insurance industry. And so Spanberg even dropped an F-bomb in this conference call. And she attributes the losses by moderate members to Republican attack ads tarring them as socialists and accusing them of wanting to defund the police. And she says these ads were enabled by the rhetoric of progressive lawmakers. And Spanberg gets that completely wrong. The Republicans make this shit up. Joe Biden is a corporate Democrat, a moderate by any standard. And Trump led the charge to say he's far-left, Antifa, socialist, communist, anarchist. And so these conservaDems are invoking the lies and campaign rhetoric of Republicans and saying that we have to duck, we have to camouflage ourselves. We have to submerge those differences. And again, I think that is 1,000% wrong. You have to enhance the perception of differences. Honestly, even if you can't deliver on Medicare for all, it's an aspiration that many Democrats hold dearly. And it should be addressed, not ignored. And these are the same people who said that Joe Biden was the only one who could win, that Bernie Sanders would go down in flames. They don't know that, and I can't prove it either. They didn't give us the opportunity to prove it. But I believe that Sanders would have stood for such a different approach to fixing America that many Trump voters would have made the switch. And so, as I see this develop, I believe it is largely driven by polling. And in fact, was it Sherry Bustos? She's a congresswoman from Illinois. She ran the DCCC, the campaign arm of the Democratic Party. And she talked a lot about polls, blaming the pollsters. They were all wrong. But what's fundamentally wrong here is that instead of providing leadership, it enables voters to tell pollsters, yes, I want Medicare for all. The Democrats just focused on trying to prop up Obamacare, which is deeply flawed. It's better than nothing. I don't want to see it killed by the Supreme Court. But under Obamacare, millions of people who lost their jobs this year don't have health care. They don't have health insurance. And the Democrats didn't run on that. They just blandly talked about pre-existing conditions. That caused the Republicans to lie, saying, oh, yeah, we're for pre-existing condition protection. It will magically appear as soon as we bury Obamacare. So Rashida Tlaib, one of the squad members from Detroit, who was easily reelected on Tuesday, she accused her centrist colleagues of only being interested in appealing to white people in suburbia. Don't blame myself and others who are fighting for issues that matter to our communities, she said. An outspoken progressive, Pramila Jayapal from Seattle, also spoke out, warning that House Democrats could see even bigger losses in 22 and 24 if they don't engage voters motivated by ambitious progressive policy issues. And echoing Tlaib, she said, don't be so quick to blame the progressive members who have been responsible for energizing these groups who will ultimately save the day for the race for the White House. And that's where Norman Solomon picks up with a commentary published over at Common Dreams. And he's getting in line behind African-American progressives and Latinos, who both claim that they provided the edge that made Joe Biden, narrowly, the winner of the Electoral College. And of course, taking the presidency is yet another step. We'll see if Trump will yield or if he will continue to fight on into late November and December. But Solomon says it was progressives who made Trump's defeat possible. He writes, from the outset, progressive organizations and individuals should confront Biden and other elected Democrats about profound matters. Progressives would be wise to quickly follow up on Biden's victory with a combative approach toward corporate Democrats. Powerful party leaders have already signaled their intentions to aggressively marginalize progressives. Politico reported that Pelosi and her top lieutenants had a stark warning for Democrats on Thursday: swing too far left and they're all but certain to blow the chances in the Georgia runoff that will determine which party controls the Senate. So I just believe that the Democrats are marching lockstep in the wrong direction and over a cliff into irrelevance. And again, I believe that if they led instead of followed, we would see different outcomes. It might cost the seats of Murphy and Spanberger, but it could provide opportunities and open doors for true progressives in other parts of the country. And I have to say, I was stunned when I got to the Washington Post today and saw this opinion piece by Paul Waldman. And Waldman and I go back to the 2007-2008 period when I was hosting a daily syndicated radio show. And once a week, we featured a person from Media Matters who talked about what Fox had done to lie about George W. Bush that week. And Waldman was one of those people. And I like Paul. But in recent years, since the rise of Hillary Clinton, his writing has mostly been in service of the corporate control of the Democratic Party. And so I was wowed and pleased when I read his piece, headlined Memo to Centrist Democrats, Stop Blaming Progressives for House Losses. And He says, what exactly are centrists asking progressives to do? It sounds like they're saying Republicans falsely accused me of believing what you believe, so that means you have to change your positions and believe only what I believe. And Waldman asked, do they want the progressives to change their beliefs on health care or economics or some other issues? Should the progressives stop advocating for their preferred agenda at all? He continues, let's not forget, the Democratic Party nominated exactly the candidate those centrists wanted, and that didn't in any way change what Republicans said about him. Biden was the moderate in the race, but Republicans still called him a radical socialist. It's utterly bizarre that after all this time, there are still Democrats who believe that if they change what they say, it will change what Republicans say about them. That's a great point. He's got more, and we should note progressive activists and politicians across the country, including in the districts represented by these centrists, worked incredibly hard to elect Biden despite the fact that he was most assuredly not their preferred candidate. Well, in fact, they had to overcome the snubs and the dismissal of Team Biden. The rejection of fracking, and I do have to say that given the narrowness of the victory that Biden appears to be eking out and the central role of Pennsylvania, perhaps it was necessary to, avoid being tagged as anti-fracking in a big fracking state. And another quote here from Paul Waldman, one has to wonder whether centrists would have put the same energy into the election had Bernie Sanders been the nominee. And more broadly, the infighting is misguided in another sense. In retrospect, what Democrats hoped for from the 2020 election, a repudiation of Trump and the GOP so emphatic that it would sweep enormous numbers of Democrats into offices at all levels on the order of the elections of 2008 or 18, may have never been realistic. And Waldman closes with this, let me be clear, I'm not saying that the best strategy for every Democrat everywhere is to embrace maximally progressive positions to produce higher turnout among the base. Representatives like Spanberger or Connor Lamb from Pittsburgh are successful because their moderate ideology is a good fit for their districts. But they shouldn't insist that every Democrat everywhere, even those who represent more progressive districts, should act as though they're running in a Republican district. Nor should they delude themselves into thinking any Democrat can determine what nasty things Republicans will say about them. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who fended off a well-funded Latina Democratic challenger in the primary and coasted to victory here in November, she said, well, look, there are swing-seat Democrat incumbents who co-sponsored the Green New Deal, Medicare for All, and other issues. And if I'm not mistaken, every single one won re-election. So the whole progressivism is bad argument just doesn't have any compelling evidence that I've seen. When it comes to defund and socialism attacks, people need to realize these are racial resentment attacks. She is showing remarkable political skills. There are a few areas where, AOC is absent. She doesn't speak out much about Israel and Palestine, and I have not heard her take a smart position on Venezuela, for example. So this blame the left is a consistent theme in the media today. A front-page story at the New York Times is headlined, Blue California Votes to Rein in Liberal Agenda. Now, this is a ridiculous misreading of the California electorate. First, you need to understand that there are extremely red parts of California, and the image that it is entirely a liberal state isn't true. Even the Democrats who control the legislature in Sacramento include a lot of very conservative Democrats, pro-business, pro-oil Democrats. And so the Times assigned 4 reporters to this analytical piece that doesn't appear to include much input from people who know the scene here in California, because they use the results of ballot measures, which are almost exclusively now promoted by special interests who have the money to gather the signatures to put them on the ballot and then run misleading TV ad campaigns to get them passed. That was the case in the $200 million plus spent by Uber, Lyft, and DoorDash to pass their brazen rewrite of California labor law. That's not a liberal conservative issue. That's a power issue. And California voters showed very liberal intention when they 2-1 rejected a measure that was deceptively put on by the police officers' organizations in the state to roll back the criminal justice reforms that Jerry Brown invested in while he was governor, and they fixed the errors he made the first time he was governor back in the 1970s. And voters also passed new bond measures for stem cell research. And they did reject a rent control issue. That, too, was the subject of massive spending and deceptive messaging from the real estate industry and landlords. And the measure, all it would do was allow local government to write their own rent control regulations, because presently that is all preempted by a state law. So, as you can tell, I don't agree with a lot of the analysis that is being promoted. And I have to take one more swipe at the New York Times. In paragraph 4 of this story, the first person they quote is Bob Shrum. Bob Shrum is a loser of a Democratic consultant based in Washington. And the fact that he's worked on losing presidential campaigns doesn't seem to diminish the credibility that the corporate media invests in him. You want to know how unliberal California is? Well, San Francisco voters approved new taxes on CEOs who earn more than 100 times more than their average worker. Voters agreed to a business tax change that will lead to a higher tax rate for tech companies in San Francisco. And in Los Angeles, George Gascon, the progressive former district attorney of San Francisco, defeated the African-American DA of Los Angeles, who's more of a pro-police, tough-on-crime kind of DA. And so, at least along the coast in California, the progressives are doing quite well, and they're passing, or they're electing good people, and they are passing some very progressive legislation at the ballot. So this anti-left point of view that gets promoted as fact in mainstream media in this country, when you couple that with the right-wing media that promotes conservatism as gospel, government and liberals as evil, it's a really toxic brew. I want to recommend Alan McLeod's latest report at MintPress News. He talks about the October surprise, and he basically floats the question: did the mainstream media blackout of the allegations against Hunter Biden that clearly were surfaced by Rudy Giuliani and pals as an October surprise, a political smear, did they help Biden narrowly prevail in many states? And I think it's an interesting question that McLeod explores here. And he believes that that decision was a form of protection for Joe Biden. And I don't dispute his analysis there, but I would add to it this, that I believe that it also brought some wobbly Trump supporters who had voted for him in 2016, who were thinking of going the other way, and because they believe that Joe Biden has covered up the misdeeds of his wayward son Hunter and lied about it, which is the message that went out on the right-wing channels, and most of you probably never heard it. Well, I think it had the twin effect that the blackout in the media that is consumed by Democratic voters helped Biden, and that the narrowcasting in right-wing media, Breitbart, Fox, OAN, Trump's tweets, that drew more voters and solidified some who had gone soft on Trump. So now let's take a look at the scoreboard in the presidential vote count. When I woke up this morning, it was announced that Georgia has shifted to a very slight lead for Joe Biden. And currently it is about 100. No, it's not even that. He is leading by about 2,000 and change votes, with 98% of the votes reported in Georgia. North Carolina remains in the Trump column, but it has not been called. 95% of estimated votes being reported there, and mail ballots have until November 12th to be returned. So that could explain why that hasn't shifted much, but it also hasn't been called. And then we saw earlier this morning that Biden moved into the lead in Pennsylvania, where it has currently, it's actually slimmed down to about a 7,000 vote lead at this hour, which is just about 4 o'clock Pacific time on Friday. 95% of estimated votes are reported. I think it's actually a little higher than that. And what remains are overseas ballots from the military and also some ballots that were mangled in the machinery or provisional ballots and those sorts of things. So the rest of the count is going to come in pretty slowly. But it appears pretty clear at this point that Trump has defeated Trump. And if you recall, that's the prediction I made when it became clear that Biden would be the Democratic nominee. I've never had confidence that Joe was going to beat Trump. But I have always believed that Trump could beat himself. And I think with all of his, incredible deception, his mismanagement of COVID at the very same time that cases are on a second wave surge, so many other issues, it still shocks me that 65, maybe 70 million people said, yeah, this is good shit. Let's get 4 more years of that. So Nevada added more votes to Biden's lead today, up to about 12,000. And Nevada is only announcing new returns once daily. They also have a deadline for mail-in ballots to arrive and be counted of next Tuesday. And the final state that hasn't been called is Arizona, where at this hour, with 92% of estimated votes reported, Biden has a lead of 16 to 60, 44,000 votes. So the trends are certainly in Biden's favor, and Trump is sputtering. He is spinning his wheels, and he went on television in a rather subdued manner last night. And the networks, for a change, decided that what he was saying was so flatly false that they cut away from his 16 or 17-minute ramble in the press room. Trump said things like this: if you count the legal votes, I easily win. Complaining that Democrats, the news media, pollsters, big tech companies, and nonpartisan election workers had all corruptly attempted to deny him a second term. This is a case where they're trying to steal an election, he said. They're trying to rig an election. We can't let that happen. Well, he worked very hard to rig this election in his favor. And in his infamous projection, yes, he sees his behavior in Democrats and calls that out in his hypocritical fashion. And I have been watching CNN the last few days. I like John King and the way he presents the data on the big screen there as it comes in. But I'm really annoyed by Rick Santorum, the former Republican senator from Pennsylvania, an Opus Dei Catholic who is a sanctimonious asshole. And I love watching him squirm because he needs a Kevlar vest to protect him from Trump's invective tweets. And you can see him as he reacts and tries to be honest about Trump's antics, that he still wants to soften the blow. He will say things denouncing Trump's loose talk of election thievery as dangerous and shocking. He'll declare that counting absentee ballots and counting mail-in ballots is not fraud. And then he'll soften it by saying, well, you know, Donald Trump's done a great job for the Republican Party. Look at all those Republicans who got elected and didn't lose their seats in the Senate. But what I see happening here is that Trump's extreme behavior, his desperation, is causing a lot of former allies to say, hey, Don, you're on your own with this one. Many of them who are now safely reelected see Trump as a loser and a liability. And they're hoping that he'll go away quietly, or at least go away. And how about this from good old big boy Chris Christie? He says, I talk tonight now, not as a former governor, but as a former U.S. attorney. There's just no basis to make that argument tonight. There just isn't. So Trump dispatched his sons to hold news conferences in Pennsylvania and Georgia to protest aspects of the vote. Rudy Giuliani popped up in Pennsylvania and just speculated about, are dead people voting? And then seconds later turned that into an allegation. Now, I've got it in my stack here somewhere, but the Secretary of State of Pennsylvania said, yeah, a few weeks ago, there was a guy who applied for a ballot so he could vote for his dead mother. One instance that was caught before it happened. But that's all it takes to light up the dark imagination of America's mayor. Did he say 9/11? Then we've got Don Jr. and Eric tweeting complaints that Republicans are not standing with their daddy. Don Jr. tweeting, the total lack of action from virtually all of the 2024 GOP hopefuls is pretty amazing. They have a perfect platform to show that they're willing and able to fight, but they will cower to the media mob instead. Eric, where are Republicans? Have some backbone. Fight against this fraud. Our voters will never forget you if you're sheep. And even Brad Parscale, who has been drunk and disorderly, the cops were called and he went to the loony bin. Well, he popped up to enforce the mob loyalties. He said, if you want to win in 2024 as a Republican, I would probably start saying something. And Don Jr. apparently pressured Lindsey Graham, who went on Sean Hannity's show and came to the Donald's defense, asserting with no evidence that Philadelphia elections are as crooked as a snake. So this is a very fascinating moment. And Trump feels isolated, deserted, and he fears that he's a loser. And we know that those are really like kryptonite for a narcissist like him, because he has reveled in the forced loyalty that he has enforced using Twitter primarily of his Republican cult. So he was spewing out falsehoods Like the pollsters got it knowingly wrong. Well, they did get it wrong, but I don't think it was intentional. If anything, they underestimated Trump's level of support. How could he interpret that as sinister? Well, because he has the mentality of a victim at all times. He also said the voting apparatus of the states that are shifting to Biden are run in all cases by Democrats. But that's not true. Georgia has a Republican governor and a Republican Secretary of State who both did a lot before the election to purge voters and make Georgia a safer space for Republican candidates. And the governor of Arizona is Republican Doug Ducey. So Trump steps on his own commentary, undermines the lame arguments that he is trying to make, and then he just threatens to sue everybody. Here's another quote. They're trying to rig an election. We can't let that happen. Detroit and Philadelphia, known as two of the most corrupt political places anywhere in our country. He went on to say, we think there's going to be a lot of litigation because we have so much evidence, so much proof, and it's going to end up perhaps at the highest court in the land. We can't have an election stolen like this. And in a separate article, the New York Times points out that the disinformation about this election is coming directly from the White House and often directly from our dear tweeter. This leads people like Laura Ingraham over on Fox to attack Democrats and try to preserve her access to Trump. And she said on her TV show last night, how big of a mistake is it for the Democrats to have a kind of burn-it-all-down approach? Huh? That's projection. It's the Republicans who are willing to burn things down, whether it's the system, the integrity of elections. Oh, and speaking of that, she said, the Democrats seek to destroy the integrity of our election process with this mail-in, day of registration efforts, counting after the election's over, dumping batches of votes a day, 2 days, maybe even 3 days after the election. And these slights that she cites are normal. We've had same-day registration in many states for years. Mail-in ballots are not fundamentally fraudulent. Only if you fear the voters who mailed them in. And the idea that, new votes are just showing up like they're being mass-produced on an assembly line in some Democrat's basement. Oh, like Joe Biden's basement. Just not true. Nope, not true. And so the Republican talking point is that the Democrats are stealing this election. There are chants and there are signs of stop the steal. And when I first heard that, I thought that they were still hung up on Christopher Steele from 2016. So it is somewhat comical. It's probably heartbreaking for Trumpists. But coming back to Fox for a moment, there is a clear divide between the anchors who consider themselves newscasters. I wouldn't upgrade them to journalists, and those who run the personality talk shows in the evening. So Chris Steyerwalt, who is the politics editor at Fox News, he said, lawsuits, schmawsuits. We haven't seen any evidence yet that there's anything wrong. Neil Cavuto, after Giuliani and Eric Trump were featured in a live feed from Philadelphia, he cut in and declared that Fox News had called Michigan for Biden. Later in the broadcast, Cavuto said those who doubted the election's integrity would have to prove that there was illegality. But Newt Gingrich, he's still grateful to Trump for sending him to Rome to live a life of luxury with his former mistress as the ambassador to the Vatican. Isn't that rich? Well, he's always predictably good for a Republican extreme hit. He said, I think as they watch Joe Biden's Democratic Party steal the election in Philadelphia, steal the election in Atlanta, steal the election in Milwaukee, I think the more information that comes out, the greater the rage is going to be. So he's trying to promote angry Americans who are disappointed that the Trump juggernaut appears to have stalled. And anchors like Chris Wallace and Bret Baier, they are not promoting Trump's false allegations. And I haven't seen this for myself, but according to the New York Times, after Election Day, the conservative cable network One America News posted 2 videos that have been seen 500,000 times that preemptively declared victory for Trump and made unsubstantiated accusations that Democrats were throwing out Republican ballots. And YouTube didn't remove these false claims. They removed advertising from them. And they said, well, our policy only extends to content that misleads or falsifies information about voting, not about vote counting. I have to say that I am increasingly bitter about the sordid role that Twitter and YouTube and Facebook play in our political process. They are making money while people promote false messages, misleading people, and creating these silos and separate channels that fuel a lot of the misdirection and misinformed Americans who comprise far too much of our electorate. Now, you know that hope is lost for rigging or stealing an election when Karl Rove weighs in. This is the architect of the stolen elections in Florida 2000, Ohio 2004. And this comment reminds me of times when law enforcement has hired bank robbers to help them prevent bank robberies. Here's the quote from Karl Rove. Turd Blossom, as W used to call him. Some hanky-panky always goes on, and there are already reports of poll watchers in Philadelphia not being allowed to do their jobs, Rove said. But stealing hundreds of thousands of votes would require a conspiracy on the scale of a James Bond movie. That isn't going to happen. Let's repeat that. That isn't going to happen. And it's fair to say the margin in Michigan is somewhere around 150,000. And so it's too late. Too late to steal that one. So I mentioned Eric Trump a moment ago, and BuzzFeed picks up on his new role. I guess he's competing for parity with Don Jr. He's been tweeting, this is fraud, this is absolute fraud. And Eric has used his Twitter account with 4.4 million followers to blast out false claims of vote count irregularities, prematurely claiming victory in Pennsylvania, and promoting misleading news articles. His blitz included a fake claim about Sharpies in Arizona, and if you marked a ballot with that, it may or may not count. Votes for Trump being burned, inaccurate calculations of voter turnout in Wisconsin. And I've seen people on the left pick up that same claim that there are more votes than registered voters in Wisconsin. That is not true. Eric also shared a story from a Texas website suggesting that a video showing a man wheeling a box into a Detroit polling center was importing suspicious ballots. In fact, it was a camera operator for a local TV station trundling in with his gear. Oh, and here are the details on that claim that caused Rudy Giuliani to tuck in his shirt and say, "Dead people voting?" So this comes from Pennsylvania Secretary of State Kathy Boockvar. She said, well, You probably heard some weeks ago there was a gentleman in Luzerne County who tried to apply for a ballot for his deceased mother. I don't know if you heard that, but that was several weeks ago, and that was the only incident that I'm aware of in this entire year. Oh, and Tommy Tuberville, he's the guy who blew out Doug Jones in Alabama, the lame successor to Jeff Sessions. And Tuberville, the former college football coach, said these election results are out of control. It's like the whistle is blown, the game is over, the players have gone home, but the referees are suddenly adding touchdowns to the other team's side of the scoreboard. I guess he thought that might ingratiate him with Trump, should the Donald survive. Philadelphia police said today that they're investigating an alleged plot to attack the convention center in Philadelphia where the votes are being counted. Local police received a tip about a Hummer with people who were armed with guns driving toward the vote-counting venue late on Thursday. They located the Hummer and two men who were nearby openly carrying firearms. They were arrested because they're from Virginia. You got to be a Pennsylvania resident to pack your piece in the Commonwealth. And while we don't know too much about the people who are arrested and a companion female who was not picked up by the police, we are told that the Hummer included a sticker in the rear window with a QAnon message. So Trump has been furiously firing off lawsuits all over the place. Pennsylvania, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada. But according to a law professor who is quoted here from the University of Kentucky, they all seem to have no merit whatsoever. A suit in Nevada over alleged irregular votes offered no concrete evidence for the claim. In Georgia, a judge dismissed a case in Chatham County, or do you say Chatham, in which the campaign alleged 53 ballots missed the deadline, were mingled with valid ballots, and that apparently is not true. In Michigan, a judge dismissed a suit from the campaign that alleged poll observers were not being given meaningful access. The judge said there was not a legal basis requiring this, but said that the access was adequate. Oh, and here's a great quote from Justin Levitt, a law professor at Loyola Law School in Los Angeles. He said it could be reflex. On most people, if you hit their patellar tendon with a small rubber mallet, you get a knee jerk. With Trump, it's possible that if you hit his patellar tendon with a small rubber mallet, you get a lawsuit. Republicans also yesterday withdrew a case challenging how mail-in ballots were being handled in a suburban Philadelphia county, but they did get an order from a judge in Philadelphia allowing observers to get a little closer to the ballot counters that they are watching. So Georgia and already Wisconsin are expected to conduct recounts of these very close election numbers. And in Georgia, they have to wait until the results are certified, and then it takes about a week to recount all of the ballots. So that could push a recount and final number into Thanksgiving or even a little bit beyond. One of Steve Bannon's Twitter accounts has been just completely removed after he tweeted a claim that in a second Trump term that he wanted to see Christopher Wray, the FBI director, and Dr. Anthony Fauci not only fired. He said, "I'd like to take them back to the old times of Tudor England. I would put their heads on pikes. I'd put them at the two corners of the White House as a warning to federal bureaucrats. You either get with the program or you're gone." It took Facebook 10 hours to remove that, and Twitter banned his War Room account permanently, saying that he had glorified violence. Here's today's COVID-19 update, and I will note without irony that COVID has not only failed to go away because it was a media hoax, but the case numbers just continue to climb and set new records here in the United States. Yesterday, 121,504 new cases were identified, and 1,108 deaths were reported here in the United States, bringing the total to just under 236,000. And these new records are a sharp uptick over the previous day, and the rise in cases in recent weeks is part of the latest wave of infections sweeping through the Midwest and Northeast, where hospitalizations have also spiked. More than 53,000 people nationwide were being treated in hospitals on Thursday, a figure not seen since early August. And Illinois has nearly 10,000 new cases, Michigan 7,000, Iowa 5,000, Ohio and Indiana in the 4,000 range, like Minnesota at 4,000. And Denmark has decided that there has been a mutation of this virus into the mink population. And health authorities have found strains in humans and in mink which show decreased sensitivity against antibodies, potentially lowering the efficacy of future vaccines. The Prime Minister announced that, and authorities in Denmark said that 5 cases of the new virus strain have been recorded on mink farms, 12 cases in humans, and that there were between 15 million and 17 million mink in the entire country. So this kind of an animal-to-human transmission, or was it the other way around, is concerning. Outbreaks at mink farms have persisted despite efforts to cull infected animals that began back in June. Denmark will reduce its mink population after this mutation was found, and the police, army, and home guard will be deployed to speed up the culling process. Also in Denmark, more than 250,000 Danes went into lockdown Friday. I want to give a shout-out to our friend Jens on the island of Bornholm. I hope you're safe and hunkered down there, Jens. Anyway, this is occurring in the northern region of the country, related to the infection of minks. The virus evolves constantly, and to date there's no evidence that any of the mutations pose an increased danger to humans, but the Danish authorities are not taking any chances. Even without a presidential winner, one thing is certain: the 2020 election results were a disaster for public health. Results from Tuesday and early Wednesday underscore just how many Americans agree with the president, who has called the nation's top scientists idiots, openly mocked mask wearing, and has insisted that states must be liberated from lockdowns. No matter who wins the presidency, more than 67 million Americans already seem to have sided with Trump on public health. And get this, according to the Associated Press, in an analysis of 376 counties across the country, 93% of the counties that went from Trump have an elevated rate of COVID infections. The AP's analysis was limited to counties in which at least 95% of precincts had reported their results. 36% of Trump voters described the pandemic as completely or mostly under control. This is in areas where it is out of control. Wow. The pandemic was considered at least somewhat under control by slim majorities of voters in many red states, including Alabama, Missouri, Mississippi, Kentucky, Texas, Tennessee, and South Carolina. Children infected with the coronavirus produce weaker antibodies and fewer types of them as adults do, according to a new study published in the journal Nature yesterday. According to Donna Farber, immunologist at Columbia University, they may be infectious for a shorter time. The study looked at children's antibody levels at a single point in time and was too small to provide insights into how the levels may vary with age. But it could pose questions for certain antibody tests that may be missing children who have been infected. Having weaker and fewer antibodies doesn't mean that children would be more at risk of reinfection, they say. You don't really need a huge, overly robust immune response to maintain protections over some period of time. I don't know that I would be especially worried that kids have a little bit lower antibody response. That's a quote from a doctor with a difficult name to pronounce, an immunologist at the University of Arizona. The type of antibodies produced by the body varies over the time and course of an infection. It was a limitation of this study because the researchers may have been comparing people at different stages of the infection. Europe is seeing hospitalization reach a troubling level in 21 countries. The Czech Republic is almost completely maxed out. Belgium, Hungary, Poland, Italy, and France all reporting real strains on their hospitals. And in the Czech Republic, well, let me just run this down for you. The top 10 European countries with elevated rates of infection right now, well, in the Czech Republic, the hospitalization rate is at 1,952% of the peak last spring. In Belgium, 126%, Hungary, 798%, Poland, 556%, Slovenia, you got that, Melania? 914%, Bulgaria, 880%, and in Italy, 78%. So it seems similar to the U.S., where this seems to be affecting smaller nations and more rural areas than the first wave, which hit urban areas much more severely. Well, 3 major drug distributors and a large manufacturer are closing in on a $26 billion deal with state and local governments to end thousands of lawsuits over these companies' role in the opioid epidemic. And the thing that's leading to a potential settlement is that they resolved how the lawyers are going to get paid. Now, the big companies are McKesson, based here in San Francisco, Cardinal Health, AmerisourceBergen, and Johnson & Johnson. This would immunize them from future lawsuits, and the money from the settlement deal is intended to help pay for treatment and prevention programs in communities that have been ravaged by the opioid epidemic. And these distributors, and McKesson is a company that employs a lot of people, generates big revenue here in San Francisco, but they and the other defendants in this case shipped nearly 21 million prescription painkillers to 2 pharmacies that are 4 blocks apart in a West Virginia town with a population under 3,000. And they just were making so much money, they didn't care what the impact was of promoting these highly addictive medications. In a setback for the immigration judges, who are completely overwhelmed by a backlog of cases, they're not actually real judges. They're lawyers who are employed by the Justice Department, and they preside over these cases where they often give short shrift to the evidence and information that is presented. But a federal labor authority this week stripped the collective bargaining powers of the National Union, representing more than 450 immigration judges. The Labor Relations Authority sided with the Justice Department in saying that immigration judges hold a position that's like management, and therefore they don't have a right to collective bargaining. But they're not like federal judges who are independent and have lifetime appointments. These are people who are, of the Judge Judy variety. The U.S. has formally left the Paris Climate Agreement 5 years after the U.S. under President Obama signed on to it. There are 189 countries that remain signed on, and it doesn't really require them to do anything particular except to set their own voluntary targets for reducing greenhouse gases, and Biden has said that he would rejoin the Paris Agreement. According to an article today at Common Dreams written by Brett Wilkins, who is a friend of mine on Facebook, under cover of the U.S. presidential election, the Israeli military bulldozed an entire Bedouin community in the illegally occupied West Bank of Palestine this past Tuesday, leaving scores of people, including more than 40 children, homeless during a cold, driving rainstorm. And just hours before the weather changed, Israel's defense forces razed the hamlet of Kirbet Humsa, near Tubas in the Jordan Valley, forcing 74 people, including 41 children, out into the approaching storm. And this is the biggest home demolition or community demolition conducted by Israel, reportedly, in the past 10 years. Also in Israel, a great report published yesterday at Mint Press News talks about a new documentary that celebrates the development of Israel's Iron Dome missile defense system. And there's more than 5 or 6 billion American dollars that have been invested in this largely mythical military system. And the article doesn't actually mention that, but I know it to be true from the investigations of Professor Ted Postel, retired from MIT. But this 3-hour documentary, according to the author here, and what is her name? It's Catherine Shihada. It has a lot of omissions. It doesn't mention what Israel did to Gaza in the winter of 2008 and 2009. It doesn't reference the blockade of Gaza and the control of life in the West Bank. And she basically criticizes it for multiple omissions. But it also exposes the U.S. investment in the Iron Dome system. And the Pentagon apparently was shamed into buying 2 different Iron Dome installations for just under $400 million. But then Israel refused to share critical proprietary information, limiting the usefulness of the equipment for Americans. And, of course, Postal says it only effectively intercepts missiles less than 10% of the time. But Israel uses it to great propaganda effect. Thanks for joining me today for my News and Comment podcast. And thanks for listening all the way to the end. You're free to share it all over the place, including with Abigail Spanberger. You'll find it on YouTube, and I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.